or good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I'm going to take a few minutes this morning to talk about a number of things. I will make some comments about our investments, but I've also been asked to talk about sort of some of the implications. I know there's a lot of uncertainty still in the market, and there's a lot of things that we don't know, but certainly there are some good indicators of what is to come. And of course, we want to think about sort of the spiritual and the eschatological implications of some of these things as well. So I'm going to try and touch on a number of those points. Just before we start my prepared comments, I did want to mention that with the general conference investments, we are invested mostly fairly conservatively. We're invested mostly in fixed income in bonds, about 90%. So the movement of the stock market at any year has fairly nominal, small impact on our investments. And even last year, stock markets were good, but that wasn't really the driving force behind our returns. It was the falling interest rates, which really made our fixed income investments go higher. As interest rates fall, the value of your bonds goes up, and that's what's really taken place over the last year in terms of our investment performance, and certainly hoping that again this year, looking at the interest rates, given that the central banks around the world continue to try and fight this COVID-19 virus and trying to make more accommodative investment environments, lowering interest rates, our investments will continue to at least do reasonably well under the circumstances. So that's sort of our outlook and our positioning. It continues to be very conservative. Our exposure to the stock market is very, very limited at the general conference. So I'm going to ask, I think Karel is running the slideshow back there. I'm going to ask him to start the presentation. I just wanted to start with a short video I had prepared with Adventist Review Television a couple of years ago. I wanted to start with that and then go into my comments. One of the topics that many Seventh-day Adventists want to know is just where are we with respect to the end of time? There's an economic framework that's been most helpful for me to visualize the relationship between finance and the things to come in the future. It's a theory called the Kondratiev wave. In 1920, a Russian economist named Nikolai Kondratiev observed that the global economy ran in cycles of about 50 to 70 years. There was a growth phase, which is called spring and summer, and then there was a plateauing of the global economy, autumn, followed by economic winter. Now, economic winters were characterized by stock market crashes, debt crisis, banking crisis, often a global depression, and followed by wars and regime changes. As we look at these Kondratiev waves over the past 200 years and compare that against prophetic events, very interesting patterns appear. Perhaps one of the most prominent things that occurred was in the year 1844, the end of one of these economic winters. William Miller had been preaching about the second coming of Christ to take place in 1844, and this coincided with that economic winter. Miller's success in preaching about the second coming of Christ may have been helped by the economic conditions of the time. People are more receptive to spiritual matters, to turn to God and to seek salvation when the conditions around them are very difficult. So this end of this economic wave came with the fulfilling of the 2,300-day prophecy. Now, the previous wave ended in the year 1789. This was the start of the French Revolution. And as the revolution progressed, it resulted in the arrest and the exile of the Pope in 1798. This was the end of the 1,260-day prophecy. And again, there's this close tie between prophecy and the Kondratiev wave. Now, the third cycle ended in the year 1896. This was shortly after the Seventh-day Adventist Church had its 1888 experience. Ellen White wrote that in 1888, the loud cry was starting, and that the latter rain was being poured out again. Unfortunately, the church, and in particular its leaders, were not ready for that outpouring of the Spirit, and we didn't see the ultimate fulfilling of the prophecy, which is the second coming of Christ. The next cycle that ended in 1945 was a very catastrophic cycle, which had 2 world wars, an era which made it very difficult for the gospel work to be finished due to wars and the closed borders. Ellen White had lamented in the year 1903 about what might have been if we had been ready to receive the Holy Spirit. Perhaps it was a cycle that offered no opportunity to finish the work. So we look at the current cycle that we're in today. We're again in economic winter. It started in the year 2000 as the tech bubble burst and the stock market crashed. Since then, governments and central banks have taken extraordinary measures to try and fix the world economy, but their efforts have really only resulted in making things worse. But the message I want to give to people today is not so much that we're in an economic winter, but rather that this economic winter perhaps is harvest time for the church, an opportunity to finish the work that God has given us, a time when people are more receptive to the gospel message and are ready to turn to God and seek salvation. Now, we prepared this video a number of years ago and had no idea of what would happen in 2020. Of course, 2020 is just an economic projection. It has, that's not a prediction of the end of the world or anything like that. But certainly these economic cycles are a very natural part of our business process. I'm going to ask that the slideshow be started at this point. Perfect. Okay, hopefully we can get this into full screen mode. All right, so these economic cycles are a natural part of the business process and are part of our history and in our present and our future of the financial world. But still, the trauma at the end of each of these economic cycles comes with fresh pain and an acute sense of helplessness for many of us who are caught in it. This cycle has been had its many twists and turns and many unforeseen developments. And certainly these black swans, as many of these unexpected, highly improbable events happen, they always seem to hit with ferocity as we come to these end cycles. Next slide, please. COVID-19 is creating an unprecedented situation for the global economy, with many of the countries in the world in a lockdown state. Businesses and trade have ground to a virtual halt. From China to Europe to America, factories, small businesses, shops, and restaurants are shuttering their doors, some perhaps permanently. The economic impact of the efforts in containing the virus is sure to be tremendous, and the fallout may linger for quite some time. Of course, the spiritual and potential eschatological implications also have come to the forefront in many of our minds. It's certain that this coronavirus is catastrophic due to the damage on people's health. It's the death toll and the stress on our health systems. Certainly from an economic perspective, the virus is not the only factor ailing the global economy. There were pre-existing conditions and other complications that have made the effect of the outbreak so severe. Over the past decade, since the global financial crisis in 2008, central banks around the world have joined to stabilize and rescue their economies. From bailouts to lowering interest rates to zero to injecting money into the banking system, governments have all tried to revive their economies. They've only really succeeded in creating a massive economic bubble as the price of assets have grown rapidly. The US stock market has gained over 300% in the past 12 years, although it's lost quite a bit in the last few weeks. Even as the real economic growth has been pretty elusive at only about 2% a year, or totaling about 21%. Though 2019 was a good year for investors, the financial bubble was becoming unstable. The Federal Reserve began cutting interest rates, even while claiming that the economy was sound. However, large bond investors moved to longer-term bonds as they anticipated economic trouble ahead. This drove bond prices higher and their investment yields or interest rates lower. By the summer, long-term interest rates were lower than short-term interest rates, and this situation always signals a recession in the years to come, in the year to come. The strain of the global financial system increased as the liquidity in the markets became scarce. By September of last year, the short-term funding markets began to freeze up. The Federal Reserve had to intervene and injected $400 billion into the system, and it continues to inject money today as liquidity continues to be unstable. Another trend that's grown over the past couple decades is our continued increase in debt and consumption. Availability of credit continued to grow rapidly, and our spending has grown. For many, this has become an unsustainable spending pattern, with consumers borrowing to enhance their standard of living. From education to housing to lifestyle and leisure, is all funded by an ever-expanding reliance in debt. And forgetting the lessons from the past two bubbles, many have failed to see the warning signs ahead. Still, others were also caught in a system of inflated prices, expensive living costs, and lower wages. This income inequality, which was difficult to escape. In 2017, 78% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck with little savings. In fact, many could not afford a $1,000 emergency. Today, as the coronavirus shutdown is keeping people from earning a paycheck, many cannot even afford the rent or necessities. With these income inequalities becoming more evident in America, many Americans have shifted their political views. Presidential candidate Bernie Sanders rose to prominence with his policies of a more socially egalitarian society. His views are resounding with a lot of voters, particularly younger voters. Whether it was a sense of social justice, reaching out for economic fairness, or a vote against the establishment, a large number of Americans were prepared to cast their vote for Bernie. But this sense of inequality and the frustration of being marginalized or anger against the establishment was not in America alone. People in countries around the world rose up to protest against governments that they feel has failed them. From the Gilets jaunes in Paris, decrying unfair taxes, the million-strong protesters in Beirut, Lebanon, raging against corruption, or the Umbrella Revolution, the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. People around the world are rising up against oppressions that they are feeling. Now, these were some of the pre-existing conditions that the COVID-19 pandemic has exploited, these comorbidities, if you will, that put the health of the global economy in danger were well apparent before the spread of the virus. One more situation that we should recall, which has impacted the global supply chain of goods, is that the disruption of the supply chain is visible in the crashing global shipping prices. The Baltic Dry Index, which measures shipping container costs, has fallen to its lowest level in decades. But perhaps forgotten on this COVID-19 panic was that the world was already struggling through a grinding trade war that was already slowing global trade. The pandemic was like a cardiac arrest on a gravely ill patient. The pandemic not only hit China, but many Asian countries like Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. These nations who supplied the world with parts and goods just stopped production and created a supply shock. The low inventory just-in-time manufacturing processes widely used by companies felt the impact within a few days. But as the virus moved west, consumers in the developed economies of the United States and Europe just stopped buying. This resulted in a demand shock, which is making it difficult for Asia to get back to work. This sudden stop of the global supply and demand chain will not easily be restarted, nor will it come back to its previous levels quickly, if ever. Countries which realize that they are so reliant on other nations for critical goods and supplies will soon begin to redesign their processes. As the pandemic grew in Wuhan, China, the world became aware of the devastating health impact that the virus could cause. It became clear that the economic fallout would also be equally devastating. As countries shut their borders and businesses closed, the global economy is rapidly grinding to a halt. The human toll and the economic price are continuing to mount. Looking ahead, estimates call for an unemployment rate of 20%, of as high as 30%, and the economic output to decline by 25% in the United States. Banks are very concerned that the worst wave of mortgage defaults ever may be coming shortly. In Europe, the forecasts are equally dire, with a drop of around 15% of GDP in the second quarter and falling as low as 6% for the entire year. While we would like to see a quick resolution to the panic, Italy's experience shows that we may have a ways to go yet. Even today, Italy continues to see around 4,000 new cases daily and 600 deaths daily. This is just up to last week. Well, to add to this problem, the US dollar has been rising sharply this year. As global trade slows, the availability of US dollars has declined. As US dollars are needed to buy commodities and many goods, a shortage of dollars creates difficulty for many nations. Also, many nations have borrowed in US dollars and they need these dollars to make their payments. Countries facing economic slowdowns also want to lower interest rates, but this would weaken their currency, making the dollar shortage even worse for them. This vicious cycle is an existential threat for many of these weaker currencies. And certainly for the General Conference, a strong dollar makes the value of tithes and offerings coming from other parts of the world considerably devalued. It would seem that the US and many other nations are already in the midst of a recession. Will it be deep enough to become a global depression that lasts for more than a year? As an aside, the IMF just came out with a report saying that they expect a global depression that's as bad as the last Great Recession. This is a question that many CEOs, leaders, and business owners and workers are facing right now. We have not seen a depression in the United States since the Great Depression in 1929. As we look back on these long economic cycles that we had just saw, we note that each of these economic cycles have ended with one or more depressions. As economies grow and plateau and decline, depression becomes a very real potential. There was a depression during the French Revolution, and in the United States and Great Britain during 1796. A deep depression occurred in 1839 and lasted to 1844. The long depression started with an economic winter in 1873 and ended with another depression in 1893. The Great Depression started in 1929 and lasted a decade. And so now we enter 2020, perhaps with the potential of another depression. So many of our members are out of work and facing great uncertainty in the weeks and months to come. The church will certainly feel the impact of this at every level of organization. It's reasonable to assume a 10 to 20% decline in giving to the churches as many struggle to afford the basic necessities for their families. This will change so many things about our lives, our society, and about our church. It will impact the trajectory of our work for years to come. But what about the spiritual impact of COVID-19? Before we touch on that topic, I do want to say a word of thanks to all of our healthcare workers in the institutions around the world, many who are battling this virus at great personal risk and sacrifice. May God protect and strengthen them, because they are often our frontline workers for our health ministry, but also in our spiritual ministry. And today, their ministry means so much to so many people. So what about our spiritual outlook? How will COVID-19 change our spiritual outlook? Well, for sure, we may be less inclined to take for granted our privilege to be able to meet on Sabbath and to fellowship, to hold hands and pray together. We may not have realized just what a privilege that truly is. We may learn to pray more earnestly and rely on God more fully. We may see each opportunity of each day and the blessings that God gives us. We may find our neighbors more open to our help and friendship and willing to hear the gospel message. And we hope that soon the COVID virus crisis will pass and we'll get back to normal and have this great outlook. But I fear that before we get to this kind of a positive outlook, and this place of peace in our hearts, we may face some anguish and soul searching in the weeks to come. When we invest money, we always find and study the reasons why a particular investment makes sense. But in spite of all the positive rationale that we can find, we're always acutely aware of the other side of the coin. What could possibly go wrong? Under what conditions do our thesis fall apart? So we should take a bit of time to think about that today. And while we look for God's protection and deliverance for the virus and from the economic fallout, and while we certainly believe in the depth of his love and the vastness of his resource and his power to deliver, we may need to stop to think about the other side of the issue. Why has God allowed this to happen? Is there a purpose to why God would have allowed this and would allow it to continue? Is there a reason why God would tarry and not come to the rescue quickly? Perhaps we need to consider these questions for a moment. Ellen White wrote of Satan's plan to deceive the very elect if possible in the last days. We can separate many from Christ by worldliness, lust, and pride. They may think themselves safe just because they believe in the truth, but indulgence of appetite and the lower passions, which confuse judgment and destroy discrimination, will cause their fall. Go, make the possessors of lands and money drunk with the cares of this life. Present the world before them in its most attractive light, that they may lay up their treasures here and fix their affections on earthly things. This was Satan's plan for us. To the extent that we've fallen into this snare of Satan, we may have to come face to face with the reality of our situation and the condition of our true self in order to be freed from this state. What will it take for God to help us see our own condition so that he can free us from this Laodicean state that we're in? This may be a painful process for ourselves, for our families and our loved ones in the weeks to come. And even for our church and for us as leaders, it may be a time of intense soul searching and prayer. We hope and pray that this will pass and everything will go back to normal so we can get on with the work of the church. But perhaps this long emergency is the work of the church. It is precisely what the church needs and the environment in which we must thrive. Joel says the meat offering and the drink offering is cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests, the Lord's ministers mourn. The field is wasted, the land mourns. For the corn is wasted, the new wine is dried up, the oil languishes. Gird yourselves and lament, ye priests, howl, ye ministers of the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, ye ministers of my God, for the meat offering and the drink offering is withholden from the house of your God. Therefore now says the Lord, turn ye even to me with all your heart, with fasting and with weeping and with mourning. And rend your hearts and not your garments, and turn unto the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and he repenteth him of the evil. This famine, this financial crisis may be in God's order to prepare his people for the final work. For as challenging as this situation may be, the promise afterwards is the very thing that we long for. And it shall come to pass afterwards that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions, and upon the servants and upon the handmaidens, and in all those days I will pour out my spirit, and I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth. The promise of the latter rain, the refreshing, comes only after the sorrows that we must face. The great outpouring of the Spirit of God will not come until we have an enlightened people that know by experience what it means to be laborers together with God. When we have an entire, wholehearted consecration to the service of God, God will recognize this fact by an outpouring of his Spirit without measure. But this will not be while the largest portion of the church are not laborers with God. God cannot pour out his Spirit when selfishness and self-indulgence are so manifest, when a spirit prevails, am I my brother's keeper? So it may be that God is waiting for his people to be enlightened with the experience of being laborers with him, who through sacrifice and dedication are serving him. When we have rid our hearts of selfishness and self-indulgence, then he may be able to pour out his Spirit. It's not more tithes and offerings that this church needs so much as it is the Spirit of God in our hearts. And in this time when we have less resources and less visible things on which to rely, perhaps we can actually be more effective in sharing Jesus. It really is total member involvement for us to receive the power of his Spirit. We as leaders must seek ways to encourage, to equip and empower our people, to energize them to work for God, to seek the empowering of his Spirit, even as he has promised. So in this moment of crisis, when we are surrounded by fear and uncertainty, and even if relief does not seem to come, perhaps this moment can be the most powerful as our church. Next slide, please. As people of God, when earthly supports are waning, we can turn to our Heavenly Father who can supply all of our needs. And with Paul, we can remember that his grace is sufficient for us, for his strength is made perfect in our weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in my infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, and in distress for his sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's my comments for this morning.